As we look at this subject, God and government, we look over the past thousands of years of how God has worked in the lives of people. The three institutions that we can, by Scripture, definitively say that God had his hand in organizing. First of all, that being the home. You understand that when God looked around and saw Adam, the only thing he saw in his creation that was not good was that man should be alone. And God made woman. And then he said, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And that prescription has been from the very beginning that the home is God ordained. The second institution that we see on the historical biblical record is that of the government. God didn't necessarily ordain monarchies or democracies or particular types of government. God simply records the first government, that being the city that Cain organized in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. It says, Cain named the city after his son Enoch. When we think of a city, it's more than just a family or a tribe. It has some degree of organization. And that will be our focus tonight. But I hesitate to not mention the other institution for which God is responsible, and that is the church. And I know that there's been a variety of definitions when it comes to the church, but the church is broadly just a collection, a congregation of people. The Israelites in the wilderness were called a church in the wilderness. The congregation of pagans were called a church. We who are part of Bible-believing churches understand that Christ died so that we could be part of a local Bible-preaching church. We'll not discuss the issue of universal church and local church at this time, but understand that there have been good churches and bad churches throughout the centuries. One only needs to read the last book of the Bible and read the histories of the church in Ephesus and the church in Laodicea and see that there are churches that are good churches and bad churches. There are churches that need to come along like the Corinthian church, but they are nonetheless a church. But our time will not be spent dealing with the home, nor with the church tonight, but our time will be spent with that second institution for which God is responsible. God is a God of order. That's why government is in place. That's why that first city was formed. I don't think Cain consciously did it so that he could conform to God's desire, but nonetheless, organization and leadership is essential in functioning in this world. By the way, I would suggest that a steady diet of focusing on government is not the healthiest diet for one to do. And I read my share of things, and whether it's on the phone or on the television set or on the radio, listening to things. But I would say that unhealthy or a steady diet of it is unhealthy. On the other extreme, kind of the head in the sand approach to government is likewise unhealthy. The principles that we'll talk about tonight and how we view government are principles that cross all national boundaries. If I were living today in the nation of North Korea, these principles would be just as applicable as they are here in America. The fact that the man who's in charge of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, or however you pronounce his name, is a dictator and a monster and a torturer and all of those things, do not diminish the fact that my responsibility as the Bible believer is to find out the Bible principle relative to government and look at those that are in government through those lenses. Some people treat government and politics like poison. They never participate. I told you the story about my cousin and her family and their complete isolation, not knowing who the president was and not knowing how often we get a president and all of those things. But I submit to you that that is a dangerous way to live, because one day, perhaps like we've just seen in the news a month or so ago, one day that baby of yours might be the baby in the hospital and ill, and instead of you being able to take the baby to another hospital and have a second opinion, or you being able to take it for another treatment, the government makes that decision. And you say, why wouldn't there in the United Kingdom, why wouldn't they be allowed to go in and take their baby out of that hospital? Because it's not an issue of the hospital, it's an issue of the police. They'll arrest that person for having done something that's against the law. And no longer is the baby your family member, it's a ward of the state. And so we watch that in all play out right before our eyes. That's the direction that easily could happen with that head in the sand approach. China, the no more than one child approach in years gone by, where the second and third. Can you imagine being a believer in China and having to wrestle with that issue of, am I going to be arrested because we have more than one child and don't have that second child aborted? So that's why we even deal with it. We can't have our heads in the sand. How does the believer live in a culture? And I submit to you that one of the things that I deal with in regard to, and we'll deal with and mention this in a little bit later, but in regard to every election, it is every election, I think this. Every single election, whether it's local or federal, national rather, every election comes down to the lesser of the evils. It's that way. It's the nature of the beast. I wish it wasn't so, but it is so. So some treat government and politics like poison. Others treat government and politics as though it's a game. It's the game of politics. It's not a game. It affects multitudes of lives, the decisions that are made. And shame on us if we only listen to the radio stations or the television stations or read the news articles. We only read it to somehow satiate our perverse curiosity. Like a game, like reading a National Enquirer, seeing who does what and when and where, and the reality is it is not a game, and we ought not to treat it that way. And the other part of that equation is that there are millions of people in the United States, and the idea is that somehow we've got to be brought together in this great unified philosophy governmentally. It's not going to happen. If you have that perspective or that pipe dream, it's not going to happen. The gap between what Bible believers believe and what non-Bible believers believe is so wide, and there are various ones that float in between. I remember years ago, many years ago, decades ago, when the riots in California happened and Rodney King had been trapped in that riot and beaten, and one of the questions he had asked was, why can't we just get along? You know why we can't get along? Because we live in a country of human beings whose hearts are infected by sinful and selfish motivations. Without new hearts, there is no new, or there is no unity. Even with a new heart, it's a challenge. Have you ever been in a church family? Here we are, professed believers trying to get along, and we have a struggle with it. Can you imagine trying to make 300 million people that live in the United States get along and all see in a unified fashion when they don't have new hearts? Somebody said, to dwell there above with those that we love, that'll be glory. But to dwell here below with those that we know, that's another story. It's tough. I remember last fall when the elections were coming around and people wanting to engage you in conversation relative, and this man that I partnered with on the bus at that time, it was obvious that he leaned considerably left. And so the day after the election, and of course, like most of you, I stayed up as late as I could possibly do and still get up for work the next day, and I watched as much as I could. And when I pillowed my head, I read what our text is going to be. In fact, I'll have you go there right now. Daniel chapter 2. When I pillowed my head, I read this because I wanted to have a perspective on it, the election. And B, I knew that in the course of the conversation of the next day, that he'd draw me into the conversation and want to know what I, as a Bible believer, felt about the election. And so I read Daniel chapter 2 and pillowed my head, and the next morning, and just as I figured would be the case, he wanted to know, well, what did you think? And I said, well, I opened my Bible, which I always have with me on the bus, usually on my phone, and I read to him Daniel chapter 2, verse 21. Join me there, please. Speaking of God, and he, God, changeth the times and the seasons, and he, God, removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. Do you realize this, that we may elect people to offices, but God is the one who controls the affairs of men. He puts up and takes down. We do our best. You say, but we don't have a king in America. We may not have a king, but we treat him like kings. In fact, this concept of quote democracy is a newfangled thing. It came about in the late 1700s. Prior to that, there have been kings and tribes and all of that for thousands of years. And I'm sure that God had a hand even in the concept of democracy, in the concept of free rule of man. But it certainly is not. It's not been through the centuries, the idea that kings ruled. If you will, go back to verse 16 for just a moment in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel went in and desired the king that he would give him time. What was this all about? Daniel was a young man, had been taken to Babylon from his home. And I can't fathom what that would have been like to say goodbye to your teenage son, 17, 18, 19 years old, and watch him go off with people that he was captive, that had captured the city. And when Daniel went in and desired the king that he would give him time, that he would show the king the interpretation, Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire the mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret. Daniel recognized something that way from afar off, that God was in control. And in this situation where the king had brought to bear Daniel's God, he wanted to make sure that he had the mind of God in communicating with the king. It's sad that we think that somehow corporations or powerful people control things. The reality is that God is in control. Hold your hand here and look in John chapter 19 for just a moment. The flaw in what was happening during the events coming up to the crucifixion of Christ, the flaw in the thinking of the people who were in control or in power, was that they controlled the destiny and the fate of the Lord Jesus. Look in John chapter 19, verse 9 and 10. As Pilate is now interrogating Jesus in verse 8, then said Pilate unto him, Jesus, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee, and have power to release thee? Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. If one could somehow go to the it's misnamed Supreme Court of the United States, perhaps it's adequately called that, of the United States. If they could talk to the 9 justices on that court and say to them what Jesus said to Pilate, you could have no power except that which was given to me. It's not the president that has allowed you to be on this court. It's the God of heaven that's allowed you to be on this court. Some 70 or 80 or 90-year-old man or woman sitting on that court can easily be dead tomorrow at the will of God. Go back to our text in the book of Daniel, and we'll leave here, John. We need not come back again. Finally, after Daniel has communicated this in verse 21, that it's God who removes kings and sets up kings, once he has accomplished that, then we see the sequence of events that happened in Daniel's life relative to the king. And it's not until chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar gets the final message that it is God who is in control. There are other events. Chapter 3, if you'll remember, we've taught this in our Sunday school classes multiple times, how that he sets up this image of himself. And if you will, in the previous chapter, after he says about setting up and taking down, he tells about the dream concerning Nebuchadnezzar, how that he would be the head of gold, and the kingdoms that were following would be silver and brass and lesser valuable. But in chapter 3, he takes that all goes to his head, and he takes that arrogance and builds an image to himself. And there he builds the image and demands that all bow down to him. If you will, in verse 28, he concludes chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of heaven. This is after the interaction with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants, that is, from the burning fiery furnace. And then in verse 29, in the latter part, there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Do you know what Nebuchadnezzar's problem still was? It's the God he's acknowledging is not his God. It's the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's the God of Daniel. The God that perhaps those in our political realm acknowledge is not their God. It's the God of the Bible. It's the God of the Bible believer, but has not yet become their God. If it had been, their conduct and conversation would be much, much different. Look, if you will, in chapter 4, verse 30. This is the God, this is the king who still has the arrogance that says in verse 30 of chapter 4, the king spake and said, Is not this Babylon, this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? And with that stroke of boasting, God brings him to his knees. What happens in chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's final recorded encounter with God. From this point on, Nebuchadnezzar is driven out into the field and for 7 years roams about as a wild man, and then God restores his sanity for just a few moments. And he ends the chapter, it says, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heavens, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. And he's speaking of himself. Finally, he recognizes that this God who was Daniel's, this God who was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this God who is the God of the Bible believer, is the God who rules over mankind. Look in chapter 5 of Daniel, verse 26. The generations have passed. Nebuchadnezzar has passed off of the scene, and his grandson now is the king of Babylon. And in chapter 5, verse 26, we see the next encounter with the king of that region. Belshazzar is having a party. He's gone to the storehouse of all the booty, all the loot that Nebuchadnezzar had brought back from Israel, and he discovered all the things that were there, the golden chalices, all the implements that had been used in the temple, and he brings them out almost in a flagrant way of saying, I'll show God that I'm in power. And he brings them in and begins to have this grand party. And in the midst of the drunkenness, on the wall, there is this finger, this hand that writes, verse 25, this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation, Daniel told him. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balance and are found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persian. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel. Verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of Chaldeans, slain. Do you recognize the fact that God at any time can bring a kingdom to its knees? Proverbs 27:1 says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, and he turns it whithersoever he will. You may bemoan the fact that President Trump was elected. You may have bemoaned the fact that President Clinton had been elected. You may bemoan those facts, but the reality is it is God that pinches the very artery that produces the life to that heart. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. When I look at those who are in control, I have to always remind myself they are not in control. God controls their lives. You say, if I were in control, I would wipe them out. But you're not in control because you're not God. God knows things that you and I don't know. What we forget is that every government, including the United States of America, every government is at best temporary. Governments that were powerful in times past, be it the Roman government or the government of Greece. It amazed me when I watch the news sometimes, and I watch the government of Greece go to the European Union, and with its hand out and hat out, asking for monies. Can we just borrow a little bit more money so we can keep ourselves going? There was a day when the government of Greece ruled the world, and Alexander conquered the kingdoms. But today it has its hat in its hand, begging for money. Governments are temporary, including the temporary government. There is no 1,000-year Reich, because at the exact time that God chose to make it happen, Hitler died. You say he died of a self-inflicted wound. God made sure that he died at that exact time. He could have died a dozen times before at the hands of others, but God knew when. I don't understand why it was at that time. I don't know why it wasn't earlier. I don't know why it wasn't at the beginning of the 30s. I don't know why it wasn't when he was a young soldier in World War I. I don't know why it wasn't, but God knows why. But the 1,000-year Reich will never happen. Governments are temporary at best. But you say, I hate the thought because I've got children and grandchildren, and I want them to grow up with all the pleasures and provisions that I've had as an American citizen. We may want those things, and I'd like to have those things, but there's no guarantee of those things. My hope is not in those things. My hope is in the same place that Daniel's mom and dad was. And that day, all those 10 or 15 or so years that they had pumped into the heart and mind of young Daniel the truths that Jeremiah had been preaching. You understand that, don't you? I think that perhaps Daniel had heard the very voice of Jeremiah preaching the truths, because it wasn't very long when he ended up in Babylon that he's communicating exactly what Jeremiah had said. I don't know if he had memorized it. I don't know if he had read it, or I don't know. It's very possible as a young lad he actually heard Jeremiah say, it'll only be 70 years and you'll be gone. You'll come back from Babylon to your homeland. Not Daniel, but the group of people. And he hung on to the Word of God. His mom and dad instilled that into their hearts. And you as parents tonight, don't instill this kind of flawed thinking that somehow governments go on forever. They don't. But God does. And He's in control even if everything's out of control. He's in control even if everything is chaos. Do you know why governments are temporary? By the way, we've been the beneficiaries of good government here to some degree. We have the freedom to do what we're doing. Churches around the world may not have that same freedom. You know why governments decrease or diminish? Because they're ruled by corrupt people. Not everybody in government is corrupt, but the vast majority, corruption is pervasive. It's like the proverbial bad apple in the barrel of apples. It'll be the downfall of that barrel of apples unless the bad apple is removed. And you can't remove them. And thus God limits them for our sake. You say, why is God protecting America today? I think perhaps one of the clues might be the hundreds of billions of dollars that are poured in missionary endeavors around the world. God's interested in communication of the gospel. God's not interested in somehow propping up a nation. The only nation that I can understand throughout the scripture that He was interested in preserving was the nation of Israel, and that was simply to get the seed here into the world. That was simply to have the seed of David to rule and reign. I think of our country. I think of the Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to visit it some 40 to 50 years after its organization in the 1770s. And when he came in the 1800s to visit, he came as a philosopher from France and political observer, and he traveled throughout the nation, the United States, and he made some observations. He said, America is great because America is good. When she ceases to be good, she'll cease to be great. He said, not until I went into America's churches and heard their pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of America's success. That's an observer, someone who had come out of the French Revolution. Contrast that, if you will, the American Revolution. And again, not everybody that participated in the American Revolution had the right motive. Not everybody that threw tea over the side of the boat was doing it because they had some noble motive. But I submit to you that the pervasive motive was for us to protect that which God had given us here in this United States, or at that time, the colonies. In contrast, the French Revolution, starting about the same time, decade or so after independence, the French Revolution revolved around elimination of anything that was religious in government. And I understand that because the government of that time that was religious was that of Catholicism, and it was abusive. The other factor was that they formed the government based upon public opinion. Guess what? When you form a government based on public opinion, it probably isn't going to be the best opinion. The motivation, oftentimes in the French Revolution, was that the impoverished would go in and ransack and take the possessions of the wealthy. That wasn't the motivation of the American Revolution. That's a little bit different. Men and women came and carved out property and said, we're going to protect this property, belongs to us. We don't care about taking the property of the wealthy landowners. Where did it get the people of the French Revolution? Within just a few decades, the famed Napoleon came on the scene and became the dictator of France. We don't want a dictator. The French Revolution produced a much different outcome than the American Revolution. For all of our flaws, it's kept us pretty safe compared to the French Revolution that's given them the nasty dictator Napoleon. De Tocqueville said this, and again, the obvious comparison is this idea of pure democracy. That is, if there are 100 people in this room, 51 of you get to determine what the other 49 have to endure. We have a republic. You understand that. That's a lot different than a democracy. But this idea of a pure democracy, which we're moving closer and closer to, is a quick path to destruction. De Tocqueville concluded this: when people realize that they can vote themselves benefits out of the public largesse, the public kitty, it's the beginning of the end. He said that the American Republic will endure until the day that its Congress discovers, listen to this, its Congress discovers that it can bribe the public with the public's own money. Isn't that odd? Here's a Frenchman warning us 150 years ago of what comes in 2017. He went on to say, the right to education, the right to health care, the right to food and housing, that's not freedom. That's dependency. And those are not rights. Those are the rations of slavery. Boy, that's pretty contemporary, isn't it? When we become addicted to the provisions of government instead of God, we're on a dangerous slope down the hill. How does the Bible believer then relate to this flawed government that he lives in? I'm glad to live in America. I'm not always proud of what Americans do, but I'm glad to live in America. I'm thankful for what we have in our country. But I'm ashamed oftentimes of the sinful behavior that has become pervasive. Look in Romans, and we'll finish up this. You can hold your hand to Daniel because we're going to come back for just one more verse. But look in Romans chapter 13, and you understand this concept, don't you? That when it comes to government, we have a responsibility, just as the disciples did in Rome. Here in Rome, we have the wicked emperors and rulers that were over the Roman Empire. And yet Paul wrote to the Roman Christians. He said, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. Why? For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Can I say that about that wicked dictator? Can I say that about that wicked emperor? And yet Paul says that about those who are in rule in that day. They're ordained of God. Whosoever there resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. They that resist shall receive to themselves damnation or judgment. For rulers are not a terror to them, terror to good works, but to the evil. Would it surprise you? I'm never afraid going down the road when I'm doing the speed limit. But when I'm exceeding the speed limit, I'm always watching right and left and behind me. You see, that's when it scares me. And that's when I decelerate. When I turn the corner and he's sitting in the weeds and I'm saying, whoops, I think I've done it now. Just listen to the law. They're not always right. In fact, sometimes they're dead wrong, but listen to them. It'll save your life. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt never praise of the same. Why? Because he's the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. You ought to be afraid. So they disrespected me. Okay, don't worry about it. I've been disrespected by a lot of people. Just do it. I drive buses sometimes in the worst environments. And I pulled in places that I shouldn't have pulled to unload people. And there are police all around guiding traffic in the middle of downtown Cleveland. And I go bang, bang, bang. And I'm thinking to myself, and they're saying, get out of here, and yelling at me. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, let me alone, buddy. No, I'm not. I'm saying, I'm getting out of here. You see, don't worry about being disrespected a little bit. Understand something, that God has ordained government because we need some semblance of order. It's a chaotic world. It's out of order. But government is there for some degree of order. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar was used as a rod to discipline the nation of Israel. But when it was all said and done, God did not hesitate to judge the nation of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar himself. Daniel 5 talks about that. We read that already. Brought the kingdom to an end. What's the second thing we need to do relative to government? Look in 1 Timothy and chapter 2 rather. 1 Timothy and chapter 2. So I regard government as ordained of God. That'll protect my life. Number 2, I exhort, therefore, Paul says, same peoples that were in control relative to Romans. Now he's telling Timothy, the young pastor, Pastor Timothy, and I saw in your bulletin you have the list of people that are in authority, president all the way down to our local officials. I exhort, therefore, that first of all, exhortation, prayers, intercession, giving of thanks be made for all men and for President Hillary Clinton. You understand? Had she been elected, no matter how repulsive that may be, no matter how repulsive it may be to pray for President Trump, you better do it because he said to do it. The reality is that our job, even if it's a pagan Herod, even if it's a pagan Pilate, even if it's a Nebuchadnezzar, even if it's the Caesars, our job is to pray for those in authority. That we may live, he said, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness. This is acceptable in the sight of God. Back up. This is our second to the last text. We're going to the book of Acts. There are limitations on this, by the way. How do I regard a government that's out of control? I regard it as ordained of God because it brings some degree of order. I regard it as in need of prayer. But thirdly, if you look here in Acts chapter 4, I regard it with limitations. In Acts chapter 5, chapter 5 and verse 17. You see, the high priest who was part of the government of that region, the high priest rose up, and all they that were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, and were filled with indignation, laid their hands on the apostles, and they put him in common prison. And you see the rest of the story. The angel opened the door, they got back out and went back to preaching. Go on down, if you will. Verse 25. Then came one and told them, these authorities, saying, behold, the men whom ye have put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people. Then went the captain with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people. Verse 27, and when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did not we straitly command you that ye should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. Here's the limitation. Though we know that government, flawed as it is and corrupt as it is ordained of God. Though we know that it's our responsibility to pray for government, it is our responsibility at that fine line, like the dear believer in China, that the government has dictated, if that child if you have a second child, we're going to kill that child in your womb, or it's against the law, then we say we ought to obey God rather than man. Don't carry your Bible anymore. Don't talk to people about Jesus anymore. We ought to obey God rather than man. You understand that? That's the limitation. But if the limitation's some inconvenience, or maybe some large inconvenience, if maybe they do something to our Social Security paycheck, I won't like it. I've worked hard to contribute to it. But we ought to obey God rather than man. Applies to those things that are biblical principles, not to those things that are inconveniences, not to those things that maybe make us a tad uncomfortable. Look back in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. And here's where we began the whole sequence in chapter 2, working our way to the New Testament, and now back to Daniel again, hundreds of years before Christ. Daniel had the perspective of the kingdom he lived in. Even though he had been elevated to a high position in this kingdom, he was still a foreigner. He was still a captive taken out of his homeland. But this is what he concluded in chapter 2, verse 44. And in the days of these kings, he's talking about the kings that, relative to the vision in the previous verses, the one Nebuchadnezzar, and then the one that would follow Nebuchadnezzar, and then the ones that would follow Nebuchadnezzar, and the ones that are still yet to follow. In the days of these kings, referenced in that image, in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms and shall stand forever. I don't care if Putin floats down the river with no shirt on, holding up and dangling the fish he caught. I'm big and strong. I don't care if Mr. Trump plays golf, or Mr. Obama for that matter, plays golf till they're blue in the face. Because one of these days, the King of Kings will come and every knee will bow, including the king, who feels as though he rules the world. He doesn't. You understand that for the Bible believer, we hang on to Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 that says, of his kingdom there shall be no end. We hang on to Luke chapter 1, where the angel came to Mary and said that he'd be the king, and of his kingdom that it'd be forever. We don't hang on to the comforts of living in this wonderful land where we have, at our worst, I hate to think about people who complain about poverty in America. I just came back from my sister's in Honduras in December. And I'm telling you, that's poverty. That's poverty. The people who are trying to manipulate impoverished people or covetous people for a vote, that's not poverty. The poorest of Americans lives like kings compared. My brother-in-law, when he came the first time to the United States back in the 70s, said, man, everybody lives like kings here. And my mom and dad's house was 100 and some odd years old that was rickety and the air blew through it. And I'm thinking to myself, everybody lives like kings here? Yeah, compared to where he grew up. You know, I've really thought about putting together a protest march to D.C. And if you want to join it, make up placards. And what we're going to do is we're going to protest global whining. And if you want to join it, I'd love to be on board. We'll put a big banner on the bus and just march it all the way to D.C. Everybody's whining about something. But one day, the King of Kings will come. Daniel's parents must have looked out the window that day. And you understand the construction of the city of Jerusalem, probably all the houses, most of the houses, were somehow interconnected to the wall, and you could look out the wall, that some narrow window, and there on the horizon, a sea of soldiers, banners and horses and chariots and all the things that you could ever imagine. A sea of soldiers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and they're all encircling the city of Jerusalem. All that Jeremiah had predicted, all that Isaiah had predicted, all that the prophets had predicted, now was coming to a head. And then mom and dad said to themselves, our hope is not in this government. Our hope is in the God of Jeremiah, the God of this Bible. See, Jeremiah had an incident where the king took what Jeremiah had wrote, took his penknife and cut it up and threw it into the fire. And Jeremiah said, no big deal. God has a good memory. And God wrote it again. She can't destroy this book. You can destroy the United States of America, but you can't destroy this book. You can destroy the United States of America, but you can't destroy the principles that are instilled in the hearts of these little guys that'll grow up to be the next Daniels, that'll grow up to be the next Ezekiels, that'll grow up to be the next Timothys. You can't destroy that. That's implanted in their hearts. And though government fails royally, the King of Kings will succeed. When Daniel got down to Babylon as a teenage boy and some years had gone by and the people that he'd gone with, and many of them been captured and taken away, Jeremiah stayed back in Jerusalem. And one day Daniel said, in fact, you're here in Daniel, just read over chapter 9. I don't know how many decades he's been here now, but it's been a long time. In Daniel chapter 9, in verse 24, actually verse 2. In the first year of the reign of Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in desolation. Folks, he said, you know, we've been here 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But Daniel said in 70 years it's all going to be done. And that same promise is what carries me through the turbulent times of God, as how he looks at government, is I know that it's temporary. And when the king comes, it'll all be done. No more elections. We're not voting on him. He's in control. Even when things are out of control, even when your bank account is affected, even when your health is affected, even when your future is, even when your comfort is affected, he's always in control. That's what Daniel hung on to. And that's what we have to hang on to. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, It's just good for us.